Hey everyone, this is Richard Seller Legal, and today our presentation is on unlawful workplace violations and where do companies violate the law. So let's get started. So how do companies violate the employment laws? There are overtime violations, minimum wage violations, off-the-clock violations, meal break violations, other pay violations, retaliation violations, workers' compensation, and state-specific violations. UCLA Workplace Violations Survey, Broken Laws, Unprotected Workers, Violations of Employment and Labor Laws in American Cities. Showed the workplace violation rates, and their study found that meal break violations came in just under 60% of those from the survey. Other pay violations, a little below that at roughly around 55%, followed by minimum wage violations, then overtime violations at a little under 20%, off-the-clock violations at 18%, followed by state-specific violations at roughly 5%, followed by workers' compensation issues and retaliation issues at roughly around 5%. The basics of an overtime claim. Employee works for over 40 hours a week for a covered employer, and they are entitled to be paid time and 1/2 for overtime for any hours worked over 40. For an employer to be legally obligated to pay overtime under the FLSA, the employer must have 2 or more employees and have gross revenues of $500,000 per year, revenue, not profit. If the employer does not make that $500,000 per year revenue threshold, an employee may still be entitled to overtime if that employee is regularly involved in interstate, across-state transactions. The FLSA applies only to employees. Therefore, if you are a true independent contractor, the overtime laws do not apply to you. And so a true independent contractor is someone who has their own company or is incorporated, B, works for whomever, whenever, not just the employer at issue, C, provides their own tools and materials to do the job, D, controls the work they do rather than being restricted by the employer's policies, E, can turn down work for the employer without consequence, F, is truly in a separate business for him or herself. If your employer knows or should know that you are performing tasks, whether at home, in the field, or in the office, for the benefit of the company, that is working time and it counts towards your hours worked during the week. Number of hours worked overtime for workers with an overtime violation. 5 hours or less came in at 35.4%, 5 to 10 hours, 25.6%. 10 to 20 hours, 26.5%, and more than 20 hours was roughly 12.4%. And this is according to the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment study done by UCLA. Overtime violation rates by occupation. In this case, child care workers came in at 90%, office clerks and couriers at 85%, home health care workers at roughly 81%, beauty, dry cleaning, and general repair workers at roughly 81% as well. Next, followed by car wash workers and drivers coming in a little under 80%. Waiters and bartenders at a little under 80%. Retail salespeople and tellers at 75%. Building services and grounds workers came in a little over 70%. Sewing and garment workers at roughly 70%. Cooks and dishwashers and food preparers roughly at 68%, and general construction roughly at 67%. Cashiers under 5%, roughly around 5%, and factory and packaging workers came in at 45%, roughly 44%. Minimum wage. Effective January 1st, 2014, Florida's minimum wage increased to $7.93 per hour for non-tipped employees and $4.91 an hour for tipped employees. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. Restaurants and service industry businesses are commonly cited for workplace violations. Minimum wage by states at the time of this writing. Minimum wage violation rates by occupation. Typically, child care workers are the highest violation rate at over 65% of charges, followed by cleaning and general repair workers, sewing and garment workers, maids and housekeepers, retail salespeople and tellers, followed again by building services and grounds workers, factory and packaging workers, car wash workers and drivers, cooks, dishwashers and food preparers, then cashiers, office clerks and couriers, home healthcare workers, security guards, general construction, waiters and bartenders, and teachers' assistants. The amount paid below the hourly minimum wage for workers with a minimum wage violation, $1 per hour or less, was roughly 40%, whereas a little over 25% for $1 to $2 per hour, and a little over 15% for $2 to $3 per hour. At a little under 10% for $3 to $4 per hour, and just slightly under 10% for more than $4 per hour. Off the clock work. If you're doing work anywhere and your employer knows or should know you are doing the work, late night emails, copying a supervisor, phone calls on the company phone late at night with clients, etc., you are entitled to be paid for that as hours worked. Meal break violations. The law does not require the employer to pay for the meal break, but if the employee works during the break, he or she must be compensated. If you do not get a minimum of 15 minutes of free, uninterrupted time, no phone calls, driving, or work-related tasks, you are entitled to be paid for that time, and it is illegal for your employer to make a deduction for this time. Off-the-clock violation rates by occupation the highest rates came in with home health care workers at roughly 90%, followed by office clerks and couriers, all the way down to cashiers, with varying rates falling down. Meal break violation rates by occupation. Again, child care workers were most often the case with over 90%. Waiters and bartenders came in next. Security guards, beauty and dry cleaning and general repair workers, home health care workers, maids and housekeepers, sewing and garment workers, car wash workers and drivers, cashiers, retail salespeople and tellers, cooks, dishwashers and food preparers, factory and packaging workers, office clerks and couriers, general construction, and building services and ground workers, with rates varying from 35% up to 90%. Other pay violations include a worker is paid late, if the worker does not receive a pay stub, if the worker is subjected to an illegal pay deduction, or tips are stolen by the employer or supervisor. Retaliation by employers. Employers are prevented from retaliating against employees who complain to management or a government agency about their working conditions. Also protected by law from employer retaliation are people who attempt to organize a union. The illegal forms of employer retaliation include threatening to fire, firing or suspending workers, cutting hours or pay, harassing or abusing workers, or giving workers a worse work assignment. Workers' compensation violations. A state's workers' compensation fund is paid into by employers, who are generally required to carry workers' compensation insurance in order to pay costs when a worker is injured or becomes sick for work-related reasons. Medical bills as well as lost wages can usually be recovered when it was caused by a work-related injury or illness. Types of illegal retaliation by employers. The most common type is employer cut workers' hours or pay, followed by the employer threatens to fire workers or call immigration authorities, followed by an employer firing or suspending workers, or an employer harassing or abusing workers or increasing the workload. So here's what the law allows. You can file most legal claims within 2 or 3 years of the date of your injury and still collect the full amount of money you deserve. However, time limits for filing a charge related to employment law can be shorter. An example, the EEOC discrimination claims need to be filed within 180 days of the incident. If there is an unlawful overtime violation, the employee generally is entitled not only to their overtime damages for 2 or 3 years, but in most cases double the actual damages owed. Your employer is also required to pay you for attorney's fees and costs, no matter how big or small your case may be. To learn more about violations in the workplace, Visit Richard Seller Legal PA at www.floridaovertimelawyer.com.